August 8th, 1963. A mail train is barreling through the English countryside, carrying what no one on board fully realizes, the equivalent of $70 million in today's money, all in used banknotes being transported from Scotland to London. In exactly 23 minutes, that train will be stopped, the driver will be attacked, and 15 men wearing helmets, gloves, and military precision will execute what newspapers will call the crime of the century. But here's what makes this story truly extraordinary. These weren't professional criminals in the traditional sense. Most of them were small-time crooks, thieves who'd spent their lives pulling minor jobs. Yet somehow they came together to pull off the most audacious robbery in British history. They stopped a moving train in the middle of nowhere. They overpowered the crew. They formed a human chain and passed 120 bags of cash from the train to waiting trucks. And they did it all in just 15 minutes. The planning took months, the execution took minutes, and the aftermath would become a decades-long saga of captures, escapes, prison breaks, and one of the most famous manhunts ever conducted. Some of the robbers would die in exile. Others would become folk heroes. One would escape to Brazil and taunt British authorities for 35 years. This is the story of the Great Train Robbery, and I'm going to tell you every detail, every twist, every shocking moment that made this crime a legend. Let me start by explaining what that train was carrying, because understanding the money is crucial to understanding why anyone would attempt something this insane. In 1963, Britain's banking system worked differently than today. There were no electronic transfers, no digital payments. Cash physically moved around the country on trains. Every day, used banknotes collected from banks across Scotland would be loaded onto the overnight mail train and transported to London, where they'd be taken out of circulation and destroyed. These weren't new, crisp bills. They were old notes, already recorded, already processed. In theory, this made them less valuable because every serial number was logged, but in practice, £2.6 million in cash, which is about $70 million today, is still £2.6 million in cash. You can still spend it, you can still hide it, you can still use it. And someone knew exactly when the train would be carrying the most money. The train was called the Up Special Travelling Post Office, or TPO. It ran 6 nights a week from Glasgow to London, a journey of about 400 miles. It wasn't a passenger train. It was a working mail train with postal workers on board, sorting mail as the train moved. But in the second car from the engine, separated from the rest of the train, was the high-value package coach. That's where the money traveled. On a typical night, this coach might carry 300,000 or 400,000 pounds, significant money, but not life-changing money. But on August 8, 1963, because of a bank holiday weekend, the amount was extraordinary. Over 2.6 million pounds in used notes, all packed in canvas bags, all locked in the high-value package coach. And someone knew about this. Someone had inside information. And that someone brought together a gang of thieves who were about to make history. Let me introduce you to the mastermind, though calling any one person the mastermind is complicated because this robbery required multiple masterminds, each bringing different skills. Bruce Reynolds was 31 years old, a career criminal with sophisticated tastes. He wore expensive suits, drove nice cars, and thought bigger than the average thief. Reynolds had been planning major robberies for years, always looking for that one perfect score that would set him up for life. When he heard about the money train through criminal connections, he started putting together a team. But Reynolds needed specialists. He needed a train expert, someone who understood how the railway system worked. He needed muscle, men who could handle themselves if things got physical. He needed drivers, logistics people, and most importantly, he needed someone who could stop a moving train without causing a catastrophic crash. This is where the plan got technical, and it's fascinating how they figure this out. British trains in 1963 used a signal system that was relatively simple by modern standards. Colored lights along the tracks told train drivers whether to proceed or stop. Green meant go, amber meant caution, slow down, red meant stop immediately. The signals ran on electrical circuits. If you knew what you were doing, you could tamper with them. You could make a green light turn red. You could force a train to stop exactly where you wanted it to stop. The gang recruited a man they called the Ulsterman, whose real identity has never been definitively confirmed. This man supposedly had knowledge of railway signals. He would be the one to stop the train. In return, he'd get a share of the money and then disappear. The gang agreed. They needed him. Now Reynolds started recruiting the rest of the team. He brought in his close associate, Douglas Goody, a hairdresser by trade, but a talented thief by inclination. Goody was smart, calm under pressure, and absolutely reliable. He became Reynolds' right-hand man in planning the operation. They recruited Charlie Wilson, another career criminal known for his nerves of steel. Wilson had done time for robbery before and wasn't afraid of going back if necessary. But he was confident they wouldn't get caught. The plan was too good. They brought in Gordon Goody, no relation to Douglas despite the similar name. Gordon was the muscle, a big man who could handle himself in a fight. They needed someone who could physically control the train crew if things got tense. Buster Edwards joined the team. Buster was a club owner and thief who was drowning in debt. He saw this robbery as his ticket out of financial trouble. He was enthusiastic, maybe too enthusiastic, but his energy and determination made him valuable. Jimmy White came aboard, a criminal with experience in organized theft. Roy James, a talented racing driver, would handle the getaway vehicles. And then there was Ronnie Biggs. Ronnie Biggs was, in many ways, the least impressive member of the gang. He was a small-time crook, not particularly bright, not particularly skilled. He'd spent most of his criminal career getting caught. But Biggs had one thing the gang needed. He knew someone who could drive a train. That's how Biggs got invited to the biggest robbery in British history. Not for his criminal genius, but because he had a contact. He brought his friend, a man the gang would call Stan Agate, though that wasn't his real name. Stan supposedly knew how to operate a locomotive. This would prove to be a critical, catastrophic mistake. The gang grew to 15 men in total. Some were active participants, others were logistics people, lookouts, or specialists brought in for specific tasks. Each would get an equal share of the money. If they pulled this off, each man would walk away with over 150,000 pounds, which is roughly $4.5 million today. Not bad for one night's work. But they needed a place to hide after the robbery. They needed somewhere close to the target, but isolated enough that no one would find them while they divided the money. They found a place called Leatherslade Farm. Leatherslade Farm was a rundown property about 27 miles from where they planned to stop the train. It was isolated, accessible by back roads, and had a large barn where they could hide their vehicles. The gang, through intermediaries, arranged to lease the farm for a few months. They told the owner they needed it for business purposes and paid in cash. This farm would become crucial to the story, both for the robbery itself and for the investigation that followed. But I'm getting ahead of myself. By late July 1963, everything was ready. The gang had conducted surveillance on the train route for weeks. They had identified the perfect spot to stop the train, Bridego Railway Bridge, near a tiny village called Ledburn, about 40 miles northwest of London. The location was perfect because it was isolated, the signal was accessible, and there were roads nearby for a quick escape. They'd rehearsed their roles. They'd prepared their equipment. They had army-style uniforms to wear during the robbery, making them look official and organized. They had vehicles staged and ready. They had lookouts positioned along the route. Everything was planned down to the minute. And then they waited for the right night, the night when the train would be carrying the maximum amount of money. That night was August 8th, 1963. At 6:50 p.m. on August 7th, the UP Special TPO departed from Glasgow Central Station. On board were 75 postal workers who would sort mail through the night as the train moved. Also on board, in the high-value package coach, was Jack Mills, the train driver, David Whitby, the fireman who assisted him, and Frank Dehurst, the guard responsible for the money coach.
The train had 12 cars. The engine pulled a car filled with mail sorting equipment, then the high-value package coach, then 10 more mail cars. This configuration meant the money coach was right behind the engine, which would become important. The train made several stops as it moved south, picking up mail and dropping off sorted bags. Everything was routine. Everything was normal. Mills had been driving trains for 26 years. This was just another night on the rails. At 3 a.m., the train was approaching Bridego Railway Bridge. They were making good time. Mills was looking forward to reaching London, finishing his shift, and going home. And then, ahead in the darkness, the track signal turned amber. Mills, following proper procedure, slowed the train. Amber meant proceed with caution. Another signal was coming up. If that one was green, they'd continue. If it was red, they'd stop. The next signal came into view. It was red. Mills brought the train to a complete stop. This wasn't unusual. Sometimes signals malfunctioned. Sometimes track maintenance required trains to pause. Mills sent Whitby, his fireman, to use the trackside phone to call the signal box and find out what was happening. Whitby climbed down from the locomotive and walked toward where the phone should be. But the line had been cut. There was no phone. And as Whitby stood there confused, men appeared from the darkness. They were wearing dark clothing, helmets, and gloves. They moved with military precision. One of them grabbed Whitby and told him not to move. Another group was already climbing onto the locomotive where Mills was sitting. The Great Train Robbery had begun. Mills, still in the driver cabin, heard sounds behind him. He turned and saw men climbing up. He stood up, ready to defend his train, ready to figure out what was happening. And then someone hit him. A blow to the head, hard, vicious. Mills went down, blood flowing from a wound on his scalp. The robbers grabbed him, told him to stay down, told him not to fight. Mills, dazed and bleeding, could only comply. This moment, this act of violence, would haunt the Great Train Robbery forever. Mills was badly hurt. The blow caused injuries that many believe contributed to his death 7 years later. What should have been a robbery without serious violence had turned into something darker. But the robbers didn't stop to worry about that. They had a train to rob, and only minutes to do it. The gang's plan was to separate the engine and the first 2 cars from the rest of the train, drive them forward about half a mile to Bridego Bridge, and rob the money coach there. This way, the postal workers in the rear cars wouldn't be able to interfere or sound an alarm. But here's where the plan hit its first major problem. Remember Stan Agate, the man Ronnie Biggs brought in to drive the train? The man who supposedly knew how to operate a locomotive? He couldn't do it. Stan climbed into the driver's seat, looked at the controls, and realized he had no idea how to move the train. Whatever knowledge he claimed to have was insufficient. The locomotive was more complex than he expected. He tried, but the train wouldn't move. The gang was panicking. They needed to move the train to the bridge. That was the plan. Without that, they were exposed, vulnerable, and running out of time. So, they made a brutal decision. They forced Jack Mills, still bleeding from his head wound, to drive his own train to the robbery location. Mills, probably suffering from a concussion, had to cooperate or risk further violence. He moved the train. Exactly half a mile up the track at Bridego Bridge, Mills stopped the train. The robbers had already used tools to disconnect the rear cars. Now only the engine and the high-value package coach were at the bridge, exactly where the gang wanted them. What happened next was organized chaos. The gang had brought a truck and positioned it next to the bridge. They'd formed a human chain from the train to the truck. Now they moved to the high-value package coach where the money was. Frank Dewhurst, the guard, was inside with several postal workers. The robbers smashed the windows, climbed in, and quickly overpowered everyone inside. They weren't gentle, but they weren't as violent as they'd been with Mills. They just wanted compliance. And then they saw the money. 120 canvas bags, each stuffed with used banknotes. The bags lined the walls of the coach. There was more money than they had ever imagined. Some of the robbers later said that seeing all that cash was overwhelming, that they couldn't quite believe it was real. But they didn't have time to admire it. They had to move. The human chain started working. One man would grab a bag from inside the coach, pass it outdoor to the next man, who'd pass it to the next, and so on, until the bag reached the truck. The bags were heavy, each weighing 50 to 60 pounds. They had to move 120 of them. For 15 minutes, the chain worked without stopping, bag after bag after bag. Some of the robbers later said it was exhausting, that their arms felt like they'd fall off, but adrenaline kept them going. This was the score of a lifetime. This was everything they dreamed of. Finally, the last bag was loaded. The truck was full. The gang had taken every single bag from the high-value package coach. They'd stolen 2.6 million pounds. The robbers ordered Mills and the other train crew to stay put for 30 minutes. They warned them not to move, not to raise an alarm, or there would be consequences. Then they climbed into their vehicles and drove away into the darkness. The entire robbery, from the moment the train stopped to the moment the gang departed, took about 25 minutes. The vehicles drove back to Leatherslade Farm, where the gang gathered to celebrate, count the money, and plan their next moves. When they started opening the bags and counting, they realized they had actually stolen even more than expected. The final count was over 2.6 million pounds, which translates to roughly $70 million in today's money. They'd done it. They'd pulled off the biggest robbery in British history. But now came the hard part, getting away with it. Back at Bridego Bridge, Jack Mills and the postal workers waited the required 30 minutes before moving. Mills was badly hurt, barely functioning, but he managed to move the locomotive back to the rear cars and reconnect the train. Then he radioed ahead to report what had happened. The first police officers arrived at the scene around 4:20 a.m. They found the tampered signal, the cut phone lines, and the abandoned stretcher the gang had brought to carry money bags. They interviewed Mills and the postal workers, getting descriptions of the robbers, though the helmets and gloves had hidden most identifying features. By dawn, the investigation was in full swing. Scotland Yard assembled a team of detectives. The Flying Squad, an elite robbery unit, took the lead. And when they calculated how much money had been stolen, they realized they were dealing with something unprecedented. The press got hold of the story within hours. By August 9th, newspapers across Britain were running headlines about the Great Train Robbery. The public was fascinated. 2.6 million pounds stolen from a train. 15 men pulling off a military-style operation. It sounded like something from a movie. Some people were outraged at the violence against Jack Mills. Others secretly admired the audacity of the crime. The robbers hadn't stolen from ordinary people. They'd stolen from banks, from the system. In working-class communities, some saw them as modern-day Robin Hoods, though they weren't giving the money to anyone but themselves. The police, meanwhile, were under enormous pressure to solve the case. The government wanted arrests. The banks wanted their money back. The public wanted answers. And then the investigation got its first big break. A farm worker named John Maris was checking on a property near Leatherslade Farm when he noticed something odd. There were vehicles hidden in a barn. The place looked occupied, but he'd heard it was supposed to be empty. Suspicious, he contacted the police. On August 13th, just 5 days after the robbery, police raided Leatherslade Farm. And what they found was extraordinary. The gang had left behind an incredible amount of evidence. There were sleeping bags, food, supplies, vehicles, and most damning of all, fingerprints. Fingerprints everywhere, on beer bottles, on dishes, on Monopoly money, on railings. The gang had played Monopoly while counting their stolen millions using real banknotes instead of play money.
The plan had been to clean the farm meticulously before leaving, wiping down every surface to remove any trace evidence. But something went wrong. Either they got careless in their excitement, or they simply ran out of time. Or the person hired to clean the farm failed to do their job properly. Whatever the reason, they left behind enough forensic evidence to identify almost everyone involved. The police now had fingerprints. They ran them through their database, and one by one, matches came back. Charlie Wilson, identified. Gordon Goody, identified. Bruce Reynolds, identified. Ronnie Biggs, identified. The list went on. The police now knew who they were looking for. The manhunt began. The arrests came quickly. Within weeks, police had rounded up most of the gang. Some were caught at home, others were found hiding in safe houses. A few had already fled the country, but were tracked down through intelligence work and cooperation with international police agencies. By September, 12 of the 15 robbers were in custody. Only 3 remained free. Bruce Reynolds, the mastermind, who'd gone into hiding. Buster Edwards, who'd fled to Mexico. And Jimmy White, who'd also gone abroad. The trial began in January 1964 at Aylesbury Court. It was one of the most sensational trials in British history. The evidence was overwhelming. The fingerprints placed the defendants at Leatherslade Farm. The timeline matched perfectly. Witnesses identified some of the men. The prosecution argued for harsh sentences. They pointed to the violence against Jack Mills. They emphasized the scale of the crime. They wanted to make an example of these men, to send a message that this kind of audacious criminality wouldn't be tolerated. The defense attorneys did what they could, but the evidence was damning. Some defendants claimed they'd been at the farm but weren't part of the robbery. Others claimed mistaken identity. None of it worked. On April 16, 1964, the verdicts came down. Guilty. Almost everyone was convicted. And then came the sentences. This is where the story takes a turn that shocked everyone, including the criminals themselves. The judge handed down sentences of 30 years for the primary participants. 30 years! This was extraordinary, unprecedented for a non-violent robbery. Yes, Jack Mills had been hurt, but he'd survived. No one had died. In the criminal underworld, 30 years was a sentence reserved for murderers. The harshness of the sentences created immediate controversy. Many people felt the punishment didn't fit the crime. 30 years for robbery? It seemed excessive. Some suspected the establishment was making an example of the gang because they'd embarrassed the authorities, because they had shown that supposedly secure systems could be beaten. The robbers were sent to various prisons across Britain, and almost immediately, some of them started planning escapes. Charlie Wilson was the first to get out. In August 1964, just 4 months into his sentence, Wilson escaped from Winson Green Prison in Birmingham. A gang of associates broke into the prison, overpowered guards, and freed Wilson. He fled to Canada, then to France, living under assumed names. But Wilson's freedom was short-lived. In 1968, British police tracked him down in Canada. He was arrested and sent back to Britain to serve the remainder of his sentence. Then there was Ronnie Biggs. Biggs was in Wandsworth Prison, serving his 30-year sentence, when he and 3 other prisoners executed an escape in July 1965. They used a rope ladder to climb the prison wall, jumped into a waiting furniture van, and disappeared into London. Biggs went into hiding in the UK for a while, got plastic surgery to change his appearance, and then fled the country. He went to Paris, then to Australia, and finally to Brazil. And this is where Ronnie Biggs' story becomes legendary. Brazil had no extradition treaty with Britain at the time. Biggs was safe there, legally untouchable. The British government tried everything to get him back, but Brazilian authorities refused to hand him over. Biggs knew this, and he started to enjoy it. He gave interviews to British newspapers. He sold his story to tabloids. He posed for photographs on Rio beaches, living openly, taunting the British authorities who desperately wanted him back in prison. He even recorded music and made appearances on British television via satellite. Ronnie Biggs became the face of the Great Train Robbery, not because he was important to the actual crime, but because he was the one who got away and wouldn't shut up about it. The British public was fascinated. Some hated him. Others admired his audacity. Biggs lived in Brazil for 35 years, always just out of reach. Meanwhile, the other robbers were serving their time. Bruce Reynolds, the mastermind who'd initially escaped, was finally caught in 1968 in Torquay. He'd been on the run for 5 years, living in Mexico and Canada before returning to Britain. He was tried, convicted, and sentenced to 25 years. Buster Edwards eventually returned to Britain voluntarily in 1966. He was tired of running, tired of looking over his shoulder. He turned himself in, faced trial, and was sentenced to 15 years. One by one, the gang members served their time. Some were released early for good behavior, others served their full sentences. They emerged from prison to find the world had changed, and their notoriety had transformed them into curious celebrities. But what about the money? This is one of the most fascinating aspects of the story. Of the £2.6 million stolen, police recovered only about £400,000. The rest was never found. Some of it was spent by the robbers before they were caught. Some was hidden by associates and never recovered. Some may have been lost, destroyed, or hidden so well that even the people who hid it couldn't find it again. There are rumors that some of the money is still buried somewhere waiting to be discovered. The robbers who served their time came out of prison broke. Whatever money they'd hidden had been found by police, stolen by associates, or was inaccessible. The great score that was supposed to set them up for life had resulted in decades in prison and nothing to show for it. Jack Mills, the train driver who was attacked during the robbery, never fully recovered from his injuries. He suffered from headaches and psychological trauma. He was unable to return to work and lived on disability. Mills died in 1970, just 7 years after the robbery. His family always maintained that the attack shortened his life, that he was never the same after that night. The death of Jack Mills cast a shadow over the Great Train Robbery mythology. What some people had seen as a victimless crime, a clever heist against faceless corporations, was revealed to have a very real human cost. A man had been hurt, a life had been damaged, a family had suffered. The robbers themselves had mixed feelings about this. Some expressed genuine remorse for what happened to Mills. Others remained unapologetic, arguing that they never intended serious violence, that the blow to his head was an accident in the chaos of the moment. But intentions don't matter much when someone is hurt. Over the years, most of the gang members died. Some passed away in prison, others lived into old age, becoming minor celebrities, giving interviews, writing memoirs, appearing in documentaries. They'd become historical curiosities, relics of a different era. Bruce Reynolds, after his release from prison, lived quietly. He wrote a book about the robbery. He expressed regret for the violence against Mills. He died in 2013 at age 81. Buster Edwards opened a flower stall outside Waterloo Station after his release. He became a local character, a former master criminal selling flowers to commuters. He died in 1994. Gordon Goody moved to Spain after his release and lived there until his death in 2016. He never expressed much remorse, maintaining that the robbery was a justified act against the establishment. And Ronnie Biggs. His story is the most remarkable of all. Biggs lived in Brazil until 2001, when his health began to fail. He'd suffered a series of strokes and needed medical care he couldn't afford in Brazil. So, in an ironic twist, Biggs voluntarily returned to Britain, knowing he'd be arrested immediately and sent back to prison to serve the remainder of his sentence.
He arrived in Britain on May 7, 2001, and was immediately taken into custody. He was 71 years old, in poor health, and confined to a wheelchair. He spent the next 8 years in and out of prison hospitals as his condition deteriorated. The British public was divided on what to do with him. Some demanded he serve his full sentence. Others argued that imprisoning an elderly, sick man who'd already spent decades in exile was pointless and cruel. Several campaigns pushed for his release on compassionate grounds. In 2009, after years of declining health and multiple strokes that left him unable to speak or care for himself, Ronnie Biggs was released from prison on compassionate grounds. He lived in a care home until his death in December 2013 at age 84. Biggs's death marked the end of an era. He was one of the last surviving members of the gang. The Great Train Robbery, once headline news, had become history. But the fascination with the crime has never died. Books have been written, documentaries filmed, movies made. The robbery has become part of British cultural mythology, a story that captures something about human ambition, audacity, and the consequences of criminal choices. What is it about the Great Train Robbery that continues to fascinate people 60 years later? Part of it is the sheer audacity of the crime. Stopping a moving train, stealing millions, executing a military-style operation with precision timing. It was bold in a way that most crimes aren't. It required intelligence, planning, and courage, even if that courage was misplaced. Part of it is the character of the criminals themselves. These weren't sophisticated international criminals. They were working-class guys from London who saw an opportunity and went for it. People could relate to them, even if they didn't approve of what they did. Part of it is the cat-and-mouse game that followed. The escapes, the manhunts, Ronnie Biggs taunting authorities from Brazil. It had all the elements of great drama. And part of it is the mysterious missing money. The idea that millions of pounds might still be hidden somewhere, waiting to be found, captures the imagination. Treasure hidden by criminals, waiting for someone clever or lucky to discover it. But there's a darker side to the mythology that often gets overlooked in the adventure story retellings. Jack Mills was a real person who was hurt. His family suffered. The violence of that night was real, not a movie scene. The consequences for everyone involved, criminals and victims alike, were profound and lasting. The Great Train Robbery wasn't victimless. It wasn't romantic. It was a crime that damaged lives, including the lives of the people who committed it. The robbers threw away years, decades, in pursuit of money they never got to enjoy. They sacrificed their freedom, their families, their futures. Was it worth it? Every surviving member of the gang in their later years said no. The money was gone. The time couldn't be returned. What they did made them infamous, but it didn't make them happy. There are technical questions about the robbery that remain unanswered even today. Who was the Ulsterman, the mysterious figure who supposedly knew how to tamper with railway signals? His identity was never confirmed. Some investigators believe he was a railway employee who had inside knowledge. Others think he might have been invented, a composite of several people's contributions to the plan. Who provided the inside information about the money shipment? Someone with knowledge of banking operations must have tipped off the gang about the unusually large cash transfer that night. This person was never identified. They got away completely, presumably with their share of the money. What happened to all the missing money? Of the £2.6 million stolen, only £400,000 was recovered. That leaves over £2 million unaccounted for. Some was certainly spent before the arrests, but all of it? Unlikely. The prevailing theory is that associates of the gang, people who helped with logistics or provided safe houses, ended up with significant amounts that were never traced. Were there more than 15 people involved? The official count is 15 active participants, but there were certainly others who helped before or after the robbery. Drivers, lookouts, people who provided false documents or safe houses. The full network was probably larger than the 15 men who were eventually convicted. The police work on the case was impressive in some ways, remarkably sloppy in others. Finding Leatherslade Farm so quickly was excellent detective work, but the forensic examination of the farm was compromised by poor evidence handling. Some fingerprints were smudged or contaminated, some evidence was lost or mishandled. The sentences handed down caused a scandal that lasted for years. 30 years for robbery seemed disproportionate, especially compared to sentences for violent crimes. Some legal scholars argued the judges were setting an example rather than administering proportionate justice. The harshness of the sentences actually generated public sympathy for the robbers in some quarters. The escapes from prison revealed serious security flaws in the British prison system. How could Charlie Wilson be freed by outside accomplices so easily? How could Ronnie Biggs climb over a wall using a rope ladder? The embarrassment prompted significant reforms to prison security procedures. The international manhunt for the fugitives was one of the most extensive ever conducted by British authorities. It involved cooperation with police agencies across Europe, North America, South America, and Australia. The persistent pursuit of Ronnie Biggs in particular became a point of national pride for British law enforcement, even though he remained free for decades. The media's treatment of the robbers evolved over time. Initially portrayed as dangerous criminals, they gradually became folk heroes to some segments of the public. This transformation bothered law enforcement and angered Jack Mills's family, who felt the suffering of the victims was being forgotten in favor of romanticizing the criminals. Several of the robbers wrote memoirs or cooperated with journalists and filmmakers. These accounts provide insight into the planning and execution of the robbery, though they're obviously biased and self-serving. They paint themselves as daring adventurers rather than criminals who hurt people. The psychology of the gang members is fascinating to consider. Most of them had engaged in criminal activity their entire adult lives, but nothing approaching this scale. What made them think they could pull off something this ambitious? The answer seems to be a combination of desperation, ambition, and the intoxicating belief that they were smarter than the authorities. In the end, they weren't smarter. They were caught, convicted, and punished. But the audacity of what they attempted and briefly achieved ensured their place in criminal history. If you visit the site of the robbery today, there's not much to see. Bridego Railway Bridge still stands. Trains still pass beneath it. There's a small plaque marking the location of the Great Train Robbery, a historical footnote to one of the most famous crimes ever committed in Britain. Leatherslade Farm, where the gang counted their money and celebrated, was eventually sold. It's a private residence now, though its connection to the robbery ensures it remains a curiosity for true crime enthusiasts. The high-value package coaches that once carried millions in cash are long gone, replaced by modern security systems and electronic banking that make such robberies virtually impossible today. The surviving members of the gang are all gone now. The last one died in 2016. They took with them the complete truth of what happened that night, the full story of how they planned it, who helped them, and where all the money went. What remains is the legend, the story of 15 men who stopped a train and stole £2.6 million. The story of a crime so bold it captured the imagination of a nation. The story of criminals who became celebrities, fugitives who became folk heroes, and a robbery that became known as the Great Train Robbery. August 8, 1963. A mail train stopped at a red signal. A driver was attacked. A fortune in cash disappeared into the night, and the Great Train Robbery entered history. 60 years later, we're still talking about it, still fascinated by the audacity, the drama, the human stories of ambition and consequence. The money is mostly gone. The criminals are all dead. The victims are remembered. But the story lives on. And somewhere out there, perhaps in a forgotten hiding place, perhaps buried under a building or lost in a demolition, there might still be canvas bags filled with old banknotes, a remnant of the greatest train robbery in history.